Hi, this is Hayden Anderson. This is my third Ethics in Practice. I don't know what happened with the last one. I'm recording this in a different way and saving it to my computer, so A, I won't lose it, and B, hopefully they'll turn in properly in the future. I'm sorry about that. Um, so, this Ethics in Practice is going to be about a New York Times article that I read earlier this week, which is remembering David Gergen. David Gergen was an advisor to four presidents, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Gerald Ford, and Bill Clinton. And he, again, as I said, he passed away at the age of 83 this week. After his terms as a presidential advisor, he would go on to become an editor and a political commentator and kind of a well respected member of the kind of punditry sphere. Um, and I want to connect both some of the meat of the article, some of the things it brings up, and also the tone that the article uses to Callison and Young, and this idea of the view from nowhere that we learned from both Callison and Young and from Nagel. Um, but I want to just start with the rhetoric that the article uses and the way it talks about Gergen, because the way that it's written is very sympathetic, which of course makes a lot of sense because this is something commemorating someone who has passed. It says Mr. Gergen wore his 6'5" frame comfortably and was graced with an easygoing manner and a verbal quickness and a ready laugh that made him popular with many White House reporters. It also says he leaked information enough to be labeled deceive by some of them. And I think this starts to kind of cue into one of the things I wanted to get at, which is this weird kind of relationship that the press and the White House have. So, the story speaks pretty kindly about him. It recognizes some of his shortcomings. Obviously, he was an advisor for some presidents who underwent a lot of scandals. Watergate for Nixon, Mr. Ford pardoning Nixon, Iran-Contra with Reagan, and then Bill Clinton's Whitewater real estate investments. But as a whole, it kind of paints him as a remnant of a political era where respect was the norm and kind of this sign of a generation that's ending, and paints him as a pretty well respected figure. But it also points out that there were a lot of reporters who had a lot of issues with him. And one of them, Michael Kelly, who was a journalist who was killed in 2003 in the Iraq War, wrote a piece criticizing him, which I'll also link in my submission, which I think about paints the view from nowhere and kind of Callison and Young. It almost makes the exact same arguments. So Callison and Young, the view from nowhere, as we talked about in class, is this idea that a lot of journalists have this inbuilt bias where they assume that the average reader is like white and upper middle class and comes from this certain privileged perspective, and that informs the respect they pay to the authority and the way they report and a lot of their behaviors. Um, a quote from Callison and Young that I think paints this really well is journalism comes from good intentions and unexamined, power laden, gendered, racialized, and colonial relations. And I think when you look at the relationship that Gergen and the White House reporters have, Kelly calls it out as being Gergenized, to be spun by the velveteen hum of this soothing man's soothing voice into such a state of vertigo that the sense of what is real disappears into a blur. And throughout Kelly's criticism, he frames the White House relation not as one of respect, but as something that's almost parasitic, where White House reporters, instead of being, as Callison and Young says, stand-ins for the public, the average citizen as witness to important events on the behalf of the collective, as almost a wing of the communications arm of the White House. Again, calling him the sieve, like, oh, he leaks enough information to us to give us our stories. But this kind of mutual acknowledgement that they might not necessarily be pursuing the truth, because this informs the kind of reporting that they're trying to make. This reporting to a white upper middle class group that are, not necessarily going to be interested in reading as many like kind of broad systemic critiques. And with my last little time, I want to bring up an ethical dilemma that kind of sprung into my head when I was doing this, but I don't know the answer to, which is obviously journalists need information from the White House. And if this is the only way to do it, is this a necessary sacrifice they need to make? I'm not sure.